Hey everybody, welcome to Outlier on Air, episode 429. This is the podcast where we talk to the founders, disruptors, and mavens of the world. As always, I'm your host, Ever Gonzalez. On this episode, we talk to Eleanor and Janie Bennett, a mother-daughter duo doing some amazing work in podcasting. Eleanor, the daughter, is an independent podcast producer and radio journalist, and Janie, the mother, has lived a very unique life. She grew up in the Australian outback and has worked with acclaimed National Geographic photographers and then some in her career. Eleanor and Janie are also producing the Questions I've Never Asked podcast. It's a mother-daughter podcast about the taboo conversations we rarely have with our parents, our grandparents, and our elders. It's a fascinating idea. That's one of the reasons that I decided to have them on the show. We got to meet them at our podcast festival in Denver earlier this year. And I knew that I needed to have them on so that we could have those type of conversations. Again, we had a great time during this episode. I really think you're going to enjoy it. So without further ado, here we go.
Time, weather, and always pass. Case of the various
Janie, Eleanor, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ever. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, good morning. This is great. Excited to be on the show.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on. We met in Denver, Colorado at one of our festivals there this summer. You guys were there. You were great. You were great, a great audience. You were taking notes. I mean, you were perfect for what we're trying to kind of bring into the community. And so we kind of talked and we kind of hit it off. And so after learning a little bit of what you guys are doing, I was like, we need to have you on the show for sure. And so anyway, thank you for being on. It's going to be an amazing discussion. So we're really excited.
So are we.
Right off the bat, what makes you both outliers?
I'll start. This is Janie. Well, I guess it's such a good, interesting question to think about. I probably starting from the very beginning, I grew up in a extremely remote part of Central Australia, and remote as in 400 miles. On a mostly dirt road to the closest town.
Wow.
And I was lucky enough to be there with my family and also be raised with one of the larger tribes of Aboriginal people in Australia, the Pitjantjatjara people of Anangu lands. And I think that had a very significant impact on both my childhood, but my entire life. We can dive more into that if we want to later. But I also did my first 6 years of schooling over a two-way radio, which was called School of the Air. It actually still exists today in a slightly different format, but back in the day when I was a student, we and all my co-students we talked to each other on a two-way radio, VHF, I think.
Now they use Skype.
And now right, exactly. Now they have satellite and Skype, and they can actually see each other. But,
Moving on up. Awesome.
Yeah, very different, very different. So it's for me, in some ways, the whole sort of resurgence of the podcast industry is just fascinates me because my education was shaped by my early education was shaped by School of the Air over radio, and here we are. My goodness, Ever.
Well, you truly are an outlier. We're going to dig into your past here in just a bit. Eleanor, what about you?
So I was dreading this question, and it's a hard act to follow my mom. Definitely had an outlier life, but I think. So I grew up in Colorado, and I was an only child, and I think my nickname growing up was Rabbit Ears because I spent a lot of time alone eavesdropping on my parents friends.
Nice.
Sometimes my mom would take me to work with her. I'd eavesdrop at Photographer's Aspen where she worked on all the different National Geographic photographers having conversations. And I think this is actually the first time I've ever thought about this connection, but I do think that is what has drawn me to storytelling and really to asking questions and to listening. Because you do spend a lot of time alone in your head as an only child. And I think that what makes me an outlier is just this like ability to, it's a curiosity. It's like I really am curious about other people and the world, and I really want to hear what people have to say, and I love to hear their stories. And I think that's also what makes doing this interview with you right now so weird and hard, because I'm not used to answering questions. I'm used to asking them.
That's right. You're not used to being on the other side of the table, but it's so far it's working, and no doubt that this is going to be an interesting conversation. I definitely think that you're both outliers in different ways. That means different things to different people, but with 400 plus episodes under our belt for this podcast, right? All we do is talk to outliers and kind of digging into your story, both of your stories. This is the right fit. So we're excited to kind of dig into it. So the way it's going to work, for those of you that are listening, we're going to talk about what you guys are doing now and then work our way backward, right? We're going to talk about the outback in Australia. Eleanor, what you kind of did growing up and early on in your career. So with that being said, let's get right into it. You guys have a couple podcasts, but the one I want to start with is this interesting idea that when you talked about it, when we were hanging out in Denver, I was excited about it, but then there was kind of that cringe factor thinking, oh, this could be like weird and slightly embarrassing sometimes. But you guys are both in it and ready to go. And so let's talk about it. The podcast that we're talking about is The Questions I've Never Asked. Tell us what it is, what you're hoping to accomplish.
So the name actually comes from a list of questions that I had for my mom in my notebook and my journal. And the title of the list was Questions I'm Afraid to Ask My Mom. So right there, it's a little cringy. Uh-huh. But it really started with this list and conversations that you and I'm sitting with my mom now, so I'm looking at her, that you and I haven't had with each other before, and questions I have about your life before I was born, or there's this question at the heart of our podcast that was really posed in an article by a woman named Courtney Martin, and she's an amazing writer and author, and she wrote this piece for On Being on Mother's Day, and it was called Seeing Our Mothers as People. And the question behind her article was, can we ever truly know the interior life of our mothers? And especially as a daughter, I think that there is this relationship that not everyone, but I'll just talk about us, the relationship that you and I have, we're so close with each other. And yet there's so much that I really only know you as my mother. And talking about being an only child again, I think there's almost like this selfish aspect to it where I only see the parts of my mom that have to do with me and that revolve around me. And so stepping back and being like, wow, my mom is this whole amazing, complicated person with all the things that come with that. And can I ever truly get to know her?
The funny thing is, when I heard this setup, it kind of reminds me of the relationship that I have with my mother, right? And it's a little bit different. And like you mentioned, I don't know her before she was a mom, and she lived a long life before that. And she was her own person with dreams and fears and all that good stuff. But all I see her now is what I remember, right, as my mother. And Janie, on the opposite end, you obviously had a long life, right? A good life, different life before you became a mom. So when this kind of idea was presented, were you like, all right, I'm all in? Or did you have some hesitations? Because it has a potential to kind of get a little awkward and a little bit weird, maybe.
Yeah, right. Well, it definitely has that potential. But I'm all in. I'm all in. So, but it's been most. Here's the thing. The transition to this podcast sort of started as something slightly different. Should I talk about that now?
Let's do it.
I mean, it's evolved. It originally was Eleanor was given a grant by an Australian businessman and actually family friend to do a podcast on basically on my life. And I think, that was, when we laid that project out, it looked like a lot of fun, a lot of adventures, and a lot of great and deep conversations with people. But somewhere in the midst, Eleanor realized that really to go much deeper with this project, and possibly to take it out of, well, not possibly, to actually take it out of just our mother-daughter relationship, but to continue to have an ongoing episode, serialized show, it would make more sense to zero in on this particular subject. So it's an interesting, just from a podcast production story. Fortunately, we had our sponsor was very open to this idea, and we've transitioned into this much more focused concept,
but also expanded
and also expanded
to other people's stories as well.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
So, Eleanor, we're fascinated by this, but knowing your mom and the history that she's had, right? We're going to get into it in a bit. A full life, like we mentioned, even before she became a mom. Would this idea work if your mom was, got married at 20, had you at 21, and, just kind of lived an ordinary life, if that's such a thing, right? Where she just didn't work. She kind of raised you, wasn't out of the house very much. Would that still work, or does it work because your mom lived such a full life?
I think it certainly is helpful that she has lived such an incredible life, but absolutely, the answer is absolutely, it would still work no matter who your mother is, no matter who your parent is. And it's, in some ways, it could be an even more interesting conversation if a child feels like their parent didn't live an interesting life. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, there's so much I think that we don't ask each other, not just intergenerational conversations and parent-child, but like anyone in our lives. Like, there are reasons we don't ask certain things, and there are certain histories that are suppressed or forgotten or never shared. And it's really important, I think, to try to dig a little deeper, because there's healing there.
There's healing there, and there's also the shaping of story can only be richer if you dive into questions I haven't asked. And I think with a lot of these interviews that we've done, it's when we shifted gears with questions I haven't asked, it was fascinating what we learned about certain aspects of family history, and whether people will go there or they won't. And some will, some won't.
So with you, Janie, you said earlier that you were all in when this was kind of presented to you. You guys have recorded.
True.
Well, no, I answered it as in the present. I'm all in. But
you're all in now.
All in. No, it definitely took some transition. Probably for several reasons. One is I felt a certain loyalty to our sponsor, and we didn't have an immediate situation where we could really sit and have that conversation. It took, it was, weeks later that we actually were able to, we really wanted to have the conversation face to face, which, was crossing the world and sitting in the Hunter Valley in Australia. So, that was one hesitation, but also just the fear around, wow, what is my child? Yeah. What are the questions she wants to ask? It definitely crossed my mind to dive into her notebook and take a look at that list.
So you're all in now, and you guys have recorded a few episodes. You guys have done, a few hours of this conversation. As of right now, Jenny, is there anything off limits?
As of right now, no, but ask the question and I guess
we'll find out.
Eleanor, on your end, is there anything off limits for you that you maybe don't feel comfortable asking? And it might change in the future, but as of right now, anything in the back of your mind that you're kind of hesitating on getting to know your mom in that way?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's much easier for me to ask you questions about your past,
Mm.
and not just fun things in your past, but things that have been hard and difficult because they've already happened and I wasn't even there for them. But it is much harder, I think, for me to ask things that either have to do with us and me and our relationship, or with my parents are still married and my dad is alive, and I have so many questions about your relationship with my dad, and your relationship with your own desire and sexuality. I hope I'm not getting weird.
We
Make
like weird.
you uncomfortable. But like there are things that, and other questions with other family members that are still alive, and this isn't just your story or my story, this is their story too, and being respectful and being careful, because this podcast really should be about healing and not about re-traumatizing
Mhm.
anyone or bringing up things that are going to hurt someone. Like, this is not meant to be that, and I don't
So
want it to be that.
it sounds like we're going to get when this is all said and done, and the first season has been released. It sounds like we're going to get the real deal there with the two of you, right? I mean, there might be some uncomfortableness and some things that maybe you won't dive too deep in, but it sounds like it's going to be real and raw.
That is definitely the plan. And
So
I think, yeah, we'll get into that later.
yeah, so far so good.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
How has this changed your relationship, if at all?
Do you want to answer that?
Well, I can. I don't. I don't feel. No, I don't really feel that it has changed our relationship. Probably what has happened, that's the transition in this, is just working as two professionals in a sense, is really a huge gift, and also very interesting when you suddenly you shift from being sort of joined at the hip as a family member to being to really working as professionals together. And and mostly it's really it's totally inspiring. But as a mother, you tend to see not just the best of your habits but the worst of your habits, and just things that, just little things that, wow, all that generational stuff and DNA stuff that is mostly just really great. But it's fascinating to observe that in a working relationship.
We're both definitely a little bit, we have procrastination issues for sure.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
little bit scattered. We're more circular thinkers than we are linear, and so I
yeah.
think it's been kind of a journey to work together and realize we're very similar, and our
That's funny.
strengths and weaknesses are very similar.
You're chuckling ever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see it a little bit for sure, and that can make it tough, but obviously interesting, right? And finding this out about yourselves and the way you work, and your weaknesses and your strength, like you mentioned, that's interesting. I love that thought, right? Again, with my mother, I I don't know that I would have the courage and the strength and all that stuff to kind of sit down and have this conversation, right? We're immigrants, right? She's old school, speaks mostly Spanish, and it's just kind of two different worlds. And I can't imagine sitting down and saying, okay, let's talk about all of it, right? She's had a crazy life, but I don't know. I don't know that I'd be able to do it. So the two of you, congratulations for being able to kind of sit down and open up yourselves not only to each other but to your audience, right? I mean, this has the potential to blow up and be a little bit of a movement.
Thank you. That's
Well,
the hope.
thank you. And yeah, we're not there yet ever, but
That's
we're
right. Well, let's
we're
talk about it real quick before we move on to other topics. Release date. What are you looking at?
We told you not to ask us that, but since you did, I would say this will be coming out in 2020, the first season of the podcast,
yeah,
and
just leave it at
hopefully
that.
early
Yeah.
2020.
That's right. Leave it at that. You leave yourself a lot of runway. That's perfect.
We have a year to work with. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, personally, I'm very excited about this, right? Because I know you guys a little bit from meeting in Denver and doing a little bit of research online with the things you guys are doing, and obviously seeing the relationship that the two of you have. It's very tight. It's very fun to see it. Again, in person and on social media, you guys are doing some cool stuff. And so I think that this conversation that you're about to release in 2020 is going to be a good one. I'm assuming there's going to be some highs and some lows if you truly open up the way you plan to open up. So again, congratulations on that. We're going to keep everybody posted, and I'm personally a fan. Now let's move on to, not only do you have this podcast, but Eleanor, you're also working on another podcast, Gen ZT.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. First of all, let's talk about the name. What does that mean?
I know, I get that. I get asked that a lot. So I did not come up with the name. It's actually a podcast by teens for teenagers from Aspen Public Radio. So it's hosted by two local girls who grew up in our valley, the Aspen Valley. And the word T, so Gen Z refers to Generation Z, which is 4 to 24-year-olds. And the word tea is a slang. It's kind of young people slang for the inside scoop, the gossip. So you say like, spill the tea, or what's the hottest tea, or those.
That's funny. I never would have guessed. I guess because we're old, right?
Yeah, all the teenagers out there are cringing by my explanation, but that's my take on it.
Okay, so tell us about the podcast. What do you hope to accomplish with it?
Yeah, so the idea started as, these two teens who grew up here in the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado pitched the idea to Aspen Public Radio, Jane Meralt and Marielle Gorsuch. And they basically said, we want to make a podcast, and we want it to be about, what it's like to be a teen. And we want it to be for our generation, not for older listeners. And Aspen Public Radio had never done a podcast before. And they, to their credit, the executive director there, she's new. She came from Colorado Springs. Tammy Turwell, she basically said, let's do it. And she hired me as a contract podcast producer to sort of walk these young teens through how to make a podcast, how to write a script, how to come up with interview ideas, and also how to hone in on what is this podcast about. So it's really about social media and how that's shaping their lives, their connections with each other, with the outside world, emotional health, mental health, politics, activism, all of it through the lens of social media.
What are some of the struggles that you're seeing with the teenagers, not just with the podcast, but in general, since you're kind of, you're not too far removed, but you're right in the middle of this project as well. Overall, what are some of the topics that are being discussed that maybe are surprising to the older generation?
I think, so just to back up for a second, when we sat down together, the three of us, to think about what is this podcast going to be, I was so excited because I was like, wow, like these teenagers can talk about, suicide rates. I know that's a little dark, but I thought it could be a really important conversation about substance abuse and mental health and things like climate change and the Me Too movement and immigration and all these things that, we are hearing about this generation in the news every day. And it's not usually very good news. It's like suicide rates are up. People are more lonely than ever, more isolated than ever, especially young teenagers. And so I was, I don't know if excited is the right word, but I was looking forward to these two girls diving into that from their perspective. And immediately they were like, whoa, that's so dark and intense, and no one in our generation is going to want to listen to that.
Really?
But we can get there. It can't be, this is a podcast about suicide among teenagers. Like that was not what they wanted. And so we really, and I'm sure there are those podcasts out there, and I'm sure that they're amazing, but from the perspective of at least these two girls, they were like, we think what our friends want to listen to is something that maybe starts out a little more lighthearted. Like it's very much, them hanging out with their friends on the podcast, but then it gets into this deeper stuff in a more natural way and less of a clickbaity breaking news headlines. Like, I think a lot of what we hear in the news, whether it's about teenagers or anything else, is so dark. And it's meant to feel like entertainment, and it's meant to make you feel scared or fearful, whatever it is. And so they really didn't want that. They wanted this to be a show that was both uplifting as well as dives into deeper topics.
It sounds like this is more than just, a paying gig for you. Like it obviously in your voice and the way you describe it, it feels like this is something you're very excited about and something that you kind of feel passionate about. You being an independent podcast producer and radio journalist, is this, what does the future hold for you, right? Are you going to be jumping from project to project? I know you just got done with a project in New York City that we can talk about here in just a sec, but you're still young. What are the next 5-10 years going to look like?
Well, I think this involves my mom as well. I feel like there's a theme running through everything that I've worked on in recent years and that my mom has worked on in recent years. And that would be so cool. Like, this is our dream. So we don't know we don't know, but this is a dream, is to have a podcast production company. Nice. A couple years down the road. And the theme of that company is this idea of conversations we don't have and diving into deeper, more meaningful, sometimes taboo conversations. And there's so many podcasts doing that already, but wouldn't it be a beautiful thing to have a network of those podcasts that work together, that do live events together, that are all focused around breaking those boundaries and healing?
And listen, there might be some of that already going on, but there are so many voices that kind of need to be heard that you can be the champion of that, right? You can find a niche in these different groups even. And so if that's the case, good luck. Do it.
Thank you.
This is obviously something that's we like to have fun on the show and all that stuff, but there's some real value in the things that you guys are offering, right? Opening up to each other and other people. That's like, there's a lot of heart and soul into that, and I think you guys are doing a great job, and so keep it up for sure. We're here to support.
That means a lot, Everett. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And especially I think in these times of, when the pace of life and the effect technology has had on human connection, it just feels really great to be, really enriching to be working with a topic like this, which encourages deep, intimate conversations.
Good. I'm glad. It's funny. So I'm 43. I'm a grown man, and even I took a step out of being on social media, even though that's kind of part of the job with what we do. Took a step back for a little bit, and I was surprised at how much better I felt. Right. I mean, it's social media is great. Being online is great. The technology is awesome. But when I took a break, it was amazing. So I can't imagine what that must be like for teenagers and the pressure and, always being plugged in and all that stuff. And, that's why I guess we have so many issues right now with, suicide or just depression and anxiety. So if you guys can do that and do it in a professional way, I think that you guys can go far. Now,
Thank you.
Janie, let's talk about the stuff that is going to be interesting, I think, to our audience as well, right? We talked about the podcast that you guys are doing. We talked about Eleanor and some of the things that she's doing and how amazing she is. Now, let's kind of dig into your past, where you grew up, how that shaped you, and then how that shaped you as a mother as well with Eleanor. So let's go back to the very beginning. Where were you born and what was that like?
Oh gosh. So I was raised in Central Australia, in basically a high desert area.
The outback.
The outback,
Yeah.
right? Thank you. Yes. And our situation was unique, as I mentioned earlier. We were very lucky to share the land with the Pitjantjatjara people. And for those who don't know, their lineage stretches back anywhere between 45 and 60,000 years. It's the oldest continuous spoken language that exists in the world today. Awesome. And it just was an enormous privilege for my family and I to be exposed to that culture and to be taken in by that culture in our own childhood. And so I grew up with three brothers, and we all had our Aboriginal friends. Some of them came into the classroom with us, the ones who chose to. But in any case, it was a really fun, adventurous family life. And
so in the region where you were, is it the city or town, whatever you call it? What was the ratio between that tribe and everybody else? I mean, was it pretty evenly split, or?
No, not at all. Interesting question. We were a family of 6, and plus probably, at any given time, maybe 4 to 6 other white people, and there were 90 Aboriginal people. So, there's the ratio. And we lived on a cattle station. And so, the closest township was Alice Springs, which was, close to 400 miles away, mostly on a dirt road. So we would have a mail truck come, once a month. And if we were lucky, once a month, with supplies, but we lived a very sustainable life. My mother had a vast vegetable garden, and we obviously grew, all kinds of protein. I mean, we had beef, so we had, but we were lucky enough also as kids to be able to hunt and gather with the Aboriginal people, and to that was, in fact, any spare moment we had in our lives, we would be off chasing these giant monitor lizards, or watching them catch and capture a kangaroo for dinner, roasting, all those kinds of things. So
it's funny, we here in the States, we talk about remote locations in Montana, even in Utah, Colorado, but I mean, that doesn't even compare to, you truly were in a remote location, kind of isolated from literally the rest of the world, and being so close to that tribe. I won't even try to pronounce it, I'm sure I'll butcher it, but being so close to that tribe, what were some of the cultural differences, and how do you think that shaped your outlook as a human being and as a mother?
Well, I think one of the real takeaways is, after sort of living a lot of my adult life overseas, is I think, I have an ongoing respect for, I mean, really in their culture, silence is their first language. And by that, I mean, it's a culture that as a child, you learn to really observe, and that becomes its own language. And, obviously, well, not obviously, but there's a profound respect for elders and, adults. And so, I think, that's really probably from the day I was born, and certainly in that culture, you become an observer from day one. And that certainly has embraced, that's been my sort of life path in many ways. And how has it affected me as a mother? Well, I just think that in a lot of specifics. Well, do you have how do you think it's affected me as a mother, Eleanor? Do you have any thoughts? Well, certainly I can say one thing is that being on time, is not a strong point when you're raised also like that. You
different concept.
It's a very different concept of time. And so that's probably, has had a huge effect on me, not just as a mother, but running a business, and just really functioning in the modern world. I constantly come up against those little things that were very different in my childhood.
And Eleanor, your mom obviously lived it, right? But you grew up here in the States, right, for the most part.
Yes.
What kind of traits or what is rubbed off on from the experiences that your mom had growing up to your life and the things that you're doing now and just your philosophy in life?
Yeah, I think so. I mentioned earlier growing up with, and I never actually thought about that connection to Mimily with the silence, but feeling like I was an only child and there was a lot of silence and there was a lot of listening time for me, as I said earlier. But at the same time, our lives were so filled with, like, my mom basically creates community wherever she goes. And there's so many people all across the world because she's traveled so far and lived such a rich life, adventurous life, that wherever we go, there's a bed to sleep in, there's someone, an old friend, stories to be told. I think one of the hardest things for us getting this podcast out and launched into the world is that we both truly love stories and storytelling, and that is the part of this project that we love, is traveling around with a microphone and finding old characters from my mom's past lives and interviewing them and recording conversations of her with them, and then it's the editing and sitting down and not telling those stories anymore, but editing those stories that is so difficult for us. Because I think you grew up in a community that didn't, it was like it's an oral storytelling community. So you're always surrounded by the community. You're always telling stories. That's how history is passed down. That's how lessons are taught to younger generations. That's how wisdom is passed down. And there's no like recording that and then editing that. So it's an interesting task ahead of us. But I think that's what my mom's childhood, how it's rubbed off on me.
One of the stories that I like about this and everything you guys are doing is, Eleanor, right, when you start having your own kids and they start to kind of blossom and become young adults, they're going to have this audio recording of you and your mom, and I'm sure, right, that they're going to be feeling some of the things that you're feeling at that age, and so that's powerful, right? I can't imagine what that would be like to kind of be in the mind of my mother or my father when they were 25 and I was 25 going through similar things. They're going to be able to see that, and their grandma and all that stuff. And so that's exciting and a little scary as well.
I know, right? It's like, what do we want them to know?
That's right.
But I really do wish that, wouldn't it be amazing ever if we had those audio recordings of our families? Oh my goodness, of our parents and our grandparents. Working on this project, I just really realized that it's a huge gift to be able to have these conversations recorded. So
So my grandmother, right, obviously we're Mexican, grew up in Mexico, and when she was 16, she ran away with a traveling circus at 16, and so she traveled all over Mexico, all over the U.S., right, just working on this in this circus, and she would get in bar fights, and she would do some crazy thing. She got tattoos, right, and it was different and weird at that time, but she had all these stories to tell, and we were young, so she didn't really tell us all the gory details, but she has since passed, and I just kind of feel bad about all the stories that were there. That's because we were a little bit too young still. We didn't kind of get those out of her. We definitely didn't record them. So I think what you guys are doing, not only is it going to be beneficial for you and your family, but I think it's going to open up the line of communication in a lot of families as well, not just with daughter and mother, but everybody, spouses and grandparents and cousins. So this is important, and whatever we can do to support it, we're here, right? Or whatever our community can do, let us know, because truly, this is something that can be very powerful for generations to come if done properly.
Thank you, Ever. And I think that's one of the successes, as we were reflecting on the journey that we've been through so far just before this interview today, and I think even though this podcast hasn't launched, and in many ways it feels like we've got a lot of mountains to move before we get there, one of the coolest parts of this process has just been when we tell people about what we're doing. And actually, I think that's how we first connected with you. We were at your podcast festival in Denver, and we were sitting down. I think it was at the happy hour after it was all over, and taking it all in. And we sat down with you, and you asked us what we were working on, and we told you about questions I've never asked the podcast. And you told us this story about your mother and the journey that she and you went on, and your whole family went on, and the questions you haven't been able to ask her yet, or perhaps the opportunity just hasn't arisen yet. And that, I think that's what's really fueled us, is like all the stories we get to hear just by telling people what we're up to.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, we just had some fascinating moments. I mean, Ndaba Mandela was here recently in Aspen promoting his new book, Going to the Mountain. And he was raised by his grandfather, Nelson Mandela, and is currently the custodian of Mandela's home in South Africa. And he's on book tour, so he's wildly promoting this book, and and very engaging. And at the very end, will you tell the story of? Yeah,
well, we stood in line to have our book signed by him. He's an amazing man, and we told him when we got our chance to have our book signed and have a short little conversation with him. He asked who we were and what we were doing. We told him about this project, and then we asked him, is there one question that you wished you'd gotten to ask your grandfather?
Oh, that's awesome.
And he totally dropped. I mean, you pointed us out, Mom, that he dropped into silence. He didn't even look at us for a little while, and we were like, "Oh shit, did we ask?"
Yeah. No, it was very powerful witnessing his. Just witnessing his whole physicality and the way he was obviously dropping into truth and transparency and, thought, I guess. And so, and then his
answer to the question, and I don't want to get this wrong. So this is my memory and my words, not his, but he wished he had asked his grandfather, Nelson Mandela, if his grandfather regretted or really why his grandfather wasn't able to have a deeper relationship with his own children.
And spend more family time with his family. He was just on the road constantly.
I think it takes a toll on you when you're like this incredible world hero and you're an activist and you're a political leader and you're doing all these incredible things, and what is sacrificed in that. So
what a powerful moment. I remember just studying his story. If I remember correctly, I think his wife was just as feisty and a kind of a rebel as well, but she would often ask, like, hey, can we focus on the family a little bit? And obviously with all that he had to bear on his shoulders, it was difficult. And so what a interesting topic, and right, and everybody has that story. Everybody has something that they wish they knew.
Exactly.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and that brings us to season 2 of the podcast. So we're really ahead of ourselves because we haven't even launched. But season 1 is the questions I haven't asked my own mother, and it's a serialized story, the story of her life through these questions. And I think it'll be 3 episodes. So it's a short season. And then season 2 is, it could go on for as long as we want it to, for as long as it feels like it's meaningful. And the idea is that each episode will be somebody else asking an elder in their life a question they've never asked, or exploring a question they've never asked. And it's really about the taboo intergenerational conversations that we rarely have, and trying to break through that and have those conversations.
It's funny, whether we understand it or not, right? The connection with our parents, grandparents, ancestors, right? All that stuff is real. And I think it's human. What's that show on TV where they kind of do the ends? They kind of go and follow their lineage with these actors and actresses and stuff like that.
Oh my God, I don't know, but I need to watch that.
Yeah, and so they get a professional and they look to see that their mother or not mother, but great grandmother was, one of the witches in Salem and all that stuff. And so like they find out on the show. And so, and it's fascinating. It was a very popular show because I think people truly want to know and want to kind of get an insight as to, where they came from and hopefully where they're going as well because of family.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing that's been so powerful is realizing, we are our ancestors. We are all the people that came into one person to make us, like all this history that we may not even be aware of.
Definitely.
That created who we are. And it comes from so many different experiences, and both good and bad, that have been passed down. And now they're learning all these things about, I'm going to butcher the name, but it's basically how trauma is transferred to our DNA and what that means for so many people who have histories that you can't even imagine. And it's crazy.
It's funny, when I first heard that, this was a couple of years ago, I was like, what are we going to come up with next to, give ourselves an out for the way we act and our shortcomings. But I guess the science is real, right? I mean, it seems to be legit for sure. Right?
That's so true.
Yeah. My great grandfather suffered this trauma, so that's why I'm a jerk today, and nobody likes me. Yeah, but I guess there's something to it. So that's true. Now, as we wrap up, you kind of talked about what the next 5-10 years we're going to be like with possibly creating this podcast production company. But so individually though, so I want the two of you to answer it individually. We'll start with you, Eleanor. In 3 years, when we have you back on the show, you yourself, to have your own episode, what are we going to be talking about 3 years from now?
Well, I'll tell you what's on my mind now, and as a next project, and I do think this relates back to the production company that my mom and I would love to have, but is climate change is on my mind right now. And I think I've had my own journey, especially recently with, this 16-year-old Swedish activist, Greta Thunberg, becoming the face of the climate justice movement. I've had my own journey of wanting to tell her story or interview her, because I have been an environmental reporter in the past, and I'm very invested in climate justice, and I want to be a part of telling those stories. And I actually went to the Denver climate strike on Friday, and there were a ton of people showed up, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. So many people are here. But really, a lot of those people, and including myself, were there to see Greta, because she's become this famous face of the movement, as I said. And Greta was last. There were 2 hours of speeches before Greta came on, and those speeches were mostly from Indigenous women, local women, women of color. It was really a powerful and incredible experience for me to take a look at myself and realize, you came to see this person, and now you're realizing, wow, how did I not know about all these other activists? And they're all either just as young as Greta or younger, and doing incredible work and putting their lives on the front lines every day for the future of everyone. And so just taking a step back and saying to myself, like, what are the stories that I'm telling? What are the voices that I am listening to? Because it is really about listening and helping others to share their stories. And maybe they don't need your help. Maybe, they just need to see it at the table so that they can tell their own story. So that doesn't totally answer your question, but I'm definitely thinking about.
No, it gives us a good picture, for sure.
And how I can make a podcast about that, or the questioning, should I be the one to make that podcast, or can I help someone else somehow make that podcast and be the host of that podcast? So that's on my mind.
Well, you're obviously very talented at what you do, and the storytelling, and being able to kind of find these stories and help shape the stories in a way that's going to be understood by the masses. And so let's spend the next in 3 years, let's spend an entire episode talking about that good stuff.
Awesome.
So thanks. Janie, what about you? we're going to have an entire episode just on you. What are we going to be talking about in 3 years?
Well,
no pressure.
You mean, yeah. So I think I mean, what's on my mind today is actually, is just recently a seed that's been inspired by the JR project that Eleanor did the audios for. One aspect of his project has been working with, or his projects is a movie that was nominated for Academy Award that he produced with Agnes Varda, who was the oldest living, I think, female film director in France and a real legend in herself. And he decided he convinced her to co-direct a film with him. And this concept of sort of him being one of the youngest stars in visual industry and her being one of the oldest, is
she just passed away.
And she just passed away at the age of
91.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just have found that whole story of JR's, very powerful. And I'm inspired to possibly, I worked with photographers and photojournalists for most of my career, and all doing amazing works. And of course, their world has changed a lot. And I'm thinking about this sort of notion of really bringing together some of the longtime greats in photography, and a number who I've had the privilege to work with, who are much older now, and bringing in younger voices. So that's just in an audio, in an audio format. So.
Yeah, with your background in photography, and we didn't really get into that, but you definitely have a rich history there with working with some of the greats and doing your own things as well. You're positioned perfectly to be able to kind of bridge that gap a little bit.
Yeah, well, I feel like I am, and it's the better thing is that it's just really deeply resonated with me watching this JR project evolve. And he's really, fascinating. I mean, a legend in his own right. And I love the fact that he's brought in the older generation, in this case, Agnes Varda, to collaborate with him. And so that's, anyway, 3 years from now, let's talk.
Let's do it. I'm putting it in my calendar. We'll definitely do it. So for those that are listening, they want to get to know you guys a little bit better, follow the podcast that you guys are working on, and just your careers and all these cool things that you guys want to accomplish in the next 3 to 10 years. Where can we find you online?
So you can find the podcast that I've been working on for Aspen Public Radio on their website. It's also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That's Gen Z T. And to follow my personal work, I'm building a website right now for Questions I've Never Asked podcast and for myself. But I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram at ellen.jane.bennett. So you can follow me there and get updates on everything we're doing. And Mom?
Well, yeah, same. Yeah.
My mom is also on Instagram at
Oh, nice.
At Janie Aspen. Follow her for a fun time.
Nice.
There's some adventures. Oh my gosh.
I follow you, Eleanor, and so you're working on some cool projects. So I encourage everybody to follow you on social media for sure, and looking forward to the podcasts that are coming out. So Outliers, feel free to share this episode, rate, review our show. But there on our website, you're going to find Janie's and Eleanor's websites, the podcast, everything that they're working on. Reach out to these guys. They're the real deal. They're working on some amazing projects, some passion projects, and then just some overall great ideas that they have moving forward. And so, Janie, Eleanor, thank you for being on our show. Thank you for being so open and just having a good time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ever, for having us on. It was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah,
and we hope you're on season 2 of Questions I've Never Asked with your
Let's
mom.
do it. Let's do it. That would be awesome.
And in Pitanjara, Yundawuro era. So there you go. Thank you so much.
I love it. Thank you. So Outliers, we'll talk to you tomorrow.